Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second installment of the Bridging the Divides guest speaker series. I'm Sofia Martinez, one of the project's assistants. And before we start, I just want to share some background about the project. Bridging the Divides is funded by the Mellon Foundation and supports the establishment of interdisciplinary study groups from across Puerto Rico and its diasporas. This year's group is led by Yarimar Bonilla and Deepak Lamba Nieves and focuses on the theme of post-disaster futures. This event is part of our year-long conversation about how to imagine radical, equitable, decolonial Puerto Rican futures, and we welcome you all today to form part of our discussion. Thank you to everyone at the Babilla Collective, and thanks to the team at Centro for helping to organize this event. Today, we'll be hearing from Yomaira Figueroa and Kyle Whyte on apocalypse and indigenizing futures. At the end of the conversation, we'll have some time for questions, so please use the Q&A function. And now I'll briefly introduce our speakers and provide their full bios on the chat. Dr. Yomaira C. Figueroa-Vásquez is the director of the Center for Puerto Rican Studies and a professor of African, Puerto Rican, and Latino Studies. Dr. Kyle Whyte is a faculty member at the University of Michigan, where he is George Willis Pack Professor in the School for Environment and Sustainability, University Diversity and Social Transformation Professor, and Professor of Philosophy in the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts. Our moderator today is Isabel Gusardo, an editor for the Puerto Rico Review Journal, co-organizer of the Puerto Rico syllabus, and the project manager for Bridging the Divides. And with that said, I'll let the interesting people take it away.
Thank you, Sophia. Also an interesting person. It's an honor for me to be moderating this conversation between you, Yomaira, and Kyle. And I just want to open it up with a question of how you each envision apocalypse or apocalypso, and how the communities and the texts that you each study inform these definitions. And here I'm really thinking about how there's such a proliferation of narratives of apocalypse right now, especially ones that are thinking about climate change and ecocide. And I'm wondering, as you're thinking about this with us, if you can speak about the differences between the Western conceptions of apocalypse and those that you each see emerging from Black communities, from Indigenous communities, and from people of color.
Well, thank you. And it's fantastic to be here. And thanks to the nice introduction, Sophia, and fantastic to work with you, Isabel. And glad to be here with Yomaira and part of this amazing community that's surrounding around Centro. And I love the work that you all are doing, the leadership, the organizing. Incredible. So a nice honor to be here. And, you know, in my work and career, I mean, I started off now a couple of decades ago, just responding to what tribal leaders were asking us to do. I'm a member of a tribe in Oklahoma that was relocated and work now in our original homelands here in Michigan. And you know, tribal leaders were saying that y'all need to find out what's happening with climate change. And so, you know, I originally worked as a community organizer within tribes, you know, building up our response to climate change or climate change plans. And we did a lot of great stuff together. We did fiction and workshops and visioning and scenarios, and talked a lot about apocalypse, and talked a lot about the sovereignty, the vision of tribes that, you know, for us, our worlds had ended multiple times through colonialism, but we continue, persist, have goals and visions, are doing all sorts of amazing things in the world to resist, fight back, and show a better way to live. But then when I started getting more into the academic literature, mostly from more privileged folks and the settler population on climate change, I realized, like, holy moly, like, these folks think that the apocalypse is something to fear in the future. I was like, these folks are really scared about kind of future. And so I realized that it really is a gauge of somebody's privilege, what their emotional life is in relation to what apocalypse means.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kyle, for starting at the way. I'm so excited to be here, first of all, and I'm really honored to be in this conversation with Kyle here at this point. I remember when I was writing my book manuscript and was writing this chapter about apocalypse. So Kyle and I had a conversation about this. I don't know if you remember that, Kyle, but you had just published this this essay that the folks had read in preparation for this. So it's really great. And added another layer for me. And actually being in Michigan added a huge, a really important layer in my thinking because of how deeply situated the indigenous communities are in the Great Lakes area in a way that had not necessarily been visible to me growing up here on the East Coast in New York City. So that was really fantastic and really challenging and exciting to kind of put that those lived experiences at the forefront. So I want to just say that. So this is really exciting for me. But one of the things that I want to say about the question of apocalypso is that there are these two ways. One that I think is actually quite funny, which I think is a kind of a throwaway, which is that I was raised a Jehovah's Witness. And so I was raised very, very, in this kind of religious home and church and multiple days a week and preaching because the end of the world was coming, and preaching because Revelation was a book that was like it would soon come and the total destruction upon the earth or whatever. So I grew up with a lot of that in my at the very front of my imagination, which is like this whole world is gonna end and I have to tell everyone about it, right? So that's a really interesting thing. It's kind of an aside piece. I think it's a pretty funny little tidbit about me and why I can talk to literally anyone and just walk up to any door and just be like, anyway, whatever. Yeah, been having to do this my whole life. Okay, so that's one thing. So, but I think that there's something very deeply embedded around the question of what apocalypse means. Because when I was writing this chapter, I wasn't thinking about that at all, but I was thinking about the way that taking from the work of Michelle Cliff and thinking about the literary imagination and what does it mean to take seriously the imaginations, the ideas, the writings, the work of people who are often ignored, Black and Indigenous people and their descendants, right? What does it mean to take seriously the work of people who have been colonized, are living, under colonial subjectship, or in kind of in structures of coloniality, which we are all living in? What does it mean to recognize that those are not complete systems, that they are systems that with very deep and long cracks in them, and that we can think, imagine, practice, believe, work, collaborate, govern otherwise in different ways, right? Than what has been prescribed or supposedly conscripted for us to do. So there are so many ways for me that thinking that the coalescing of like my work in community and in organizing, my work as a scholar and as an academic, and my like passion for literature and the way that I take seriously literature and poetics kind of came together to read this passage of Michelle Cliff and think about what happens when the other becomes the one, right? What happens when you are your ancestors in flesh? What happens when you truly believe, right? That there's a possibility for a different kind of world that very much like Kyle's work shows that the apocalypse is now. The apocalypse was 500 years ago. It was 100 years ago. It was 200 years ago, right? And so for me, the kind of question of apocalypso is one that is revelatory. And that in itself is also interesting because apocalypse itself comes from like a much more Latin and Christian worldview, right? It is part of a kind of Christian tradition to think about apocalypse as a revelation, and yet and still as an inheritance, an inherited word, I still think that it is useful for us to think that way. I also think like that climate change, and I don't want to go into the veer off into the next conversation, but thinking about climate change, thinking about the change of our landscapes, of our world is not new. But we are in our embodiment now the first to experience it in this way. And so because of that, it begs a lot of thinking and a lot of panic, I'm sure, from everyone across the world. But I think it's different when you are living and experiencing on a land that you have been in and on since time immemorial, right? Or in a place where you have been created and constituted as a new people on, as is the case in the Caribbean, right? And so in many ways, when I was taking up the question of this chapter, and I was writing this chapter when I was in Puerto Rico on a postdoc, and I remember it was like election time. It was about a year before the hurricane, and the billboards, it was just so dystopic to see the billboards for what was the incoming Rosselló, regime, right? And thinking about how horrific that was, and then thinking post hurricane, when I was still writing this chapter and thinking about what apocalypso was how much on the landscape itself was revealed. And literally, I'm thinking about like going to Puerto Rico, driving through and looking at the mountains. If you drive to Puerto Rico through the mountains, you know that you don't see deep into the mountains from the highway, from the autopista, from the expreso. You don't see that. And then all of a sudden driving into Caguas and seeing houses, seeing trees, seeing landscapes, seeing structures that I had never in my life ever laid eyes on, was like, wow, this hurricane has revealed to us not just the corruption of this government, has not just revealed to us how horrific, our systems and structures are in terms of like water, electricity, energy, food distribution, all of that, but also has revealed to us a landscape that we have not yet seen, right? And in the wake of that hurricane and all of its devastation, one of the interesting things that happened was with the kind of clearing, the kind of very violent and horrific clearing of those landscapes, was that trees and flora emerged from the bottom of right, that had been covered by canopies, and all of these new trees started to grow. Lots of yagruma was growing, right? Like a lot of things was just shooting up that had been covered before. And so for me, there are so many levels to thinking about apocalypse and what it reveals to us, not only about ourselves, but about our ancestors, about what we want in the future, but also our landscape, and the kinds of animals and non-human animals that we live with. So that's how I would think about and how I would answer that. Yeah.
Kyle, did you want to jump in? No. Okay. I'm wondering if we can, continue thinking about this connection with land. I'd like to get back into it, but right now I'm really liking this point that both of you are making of how, right, colonized peoples and people of color have been theorizing apocalypse. Like there's this long array of apocalypse that we've been theorizing, but how there are new apocalypses happening. There are new apocalypses on the horizon that are revealing new things. And I'm wondering if you can each talk about in this context, and Yomaira, you're bringing up the literature that you study, and something I love about your book is how much you really do theorize from the literature. Like I think that's hard to do. I see a lot of people having ideas and then applying them to literature. So I'm wondering if, like, from the literature that you each are studying, like what types of post-disaster futures you see emerging. And to pick up on something you said also, Kyle, like if we're thinking about seeing an upcoming apocalypse as a privilege, how much is it also a privilege to imagine a future and to imagine post-disaster futures? And one thing that I'm thinking about as I'm asking this question is how Jared Sexton has said, right, that we should understand white people's fantasies because one day they'll become legislation. And I'm wondering how people of color and colonized peoples can fantasize about the future, can have visions of the future, as they're constantly having to survive and live within the apocalypse of Western fantasies.
Yeah, with regard to like a post-disaster, post-apocalyptic future, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to think about that from my perspective in terms of the traditions that I work in, and I'll share just a few. So when we look at the history of when Indigenous people have expressed themselves about what they thought about colonialism, such as records from treaty-making processes or other venues that you can find in the archives, or memories and stories that families have, one thing you see very clearly is that Indigenous people were thinking about this in a lot of ways, but one way I wanted to just focus on here is as a massive breach of consent. Indigenous kinship traditions for generations, and just speaking for Potawatomi or Anishinaabe people, consent is a powerful kinship relationship. All sorts of different types of consent with the ecosystems, consent with non-humans, consent with different cultures, kin and non-kin. Consent is detailed and powerful and rich and takes generations to establish strong cultures, economies that are based on consent. And so one angle into understanding what colonialism is just an invasion of consent. And in terms of a more kind of indigenized or indigenous self-determination imagination of the future, is that maybe as we move through this fiasco and horrific climate change situation that we're in, we could eventually enter into a world where actually people figure out the consent issue. And people realize that actually with disasters, at one level, a disaster or a climatic event is something that we don't consent to, but how we prepare ourselves for it, how we get ready for it, how we ensure justice and equality is a matter of consent. And societies that have destroyed most of the consent within them are the ones that are the people whose consent was violated get hit the hardest. And so one way to think about it is, what's a world in which consent is restored, and that we have the adequate kinship relations of consent with all the entities, ones that we can communicate with, ones we can't communicate as clearly with climatic, environmental events that are seemingly not within the domain of consent, yet they are. But the other part of that is that what's likely to happen. And with colonialism, when I think about different eras of colonialism, most of them have some fear of apocalypse attached to the moral justifications that are offered for violence. And we see this just happening again, no different with how the dominant populations are addressing climate change, or responding or lacking to respond to climate change. And so they come up with all these metaphors. We're addicted to fossil fuels and addicted to oil and so on. And obviously those types of metaphors are ableistic, and that's another topic I won't discuss now. But on the other hand, there's this emphasis that our problem is an obsession with oil. But even the solutions to climate change are just doing the same things that the old-fashioned fossil fuel industry did, displacing people, gender and sexual violence. They're just doing the same things, destroying land. Why is that? Well, the problem isn't fundamentally, if there is a fundamental aspect to this, but if there was, it certainly is not actually an obsession with oil. It's still that the dominant players out there are obsessed with violating people's consent. They don't know how to get anything done unless, as a condition of that, they violate people's consent of the environment, consent of non-humans. And we're going to just keep having train wreck after train wreck into perpetuity until there's a fundamental shift in consent. But again, consent's just one angle. I think there's a ton of angles into it. I don't think it's the primary one or the fundamental one, but it's a critical one to think through.
Yeah, Kyle, and you're having me think. I'm thinking here about the kinds of ethical relationships we want to have, and the lack of consent that is constitutive of colonial modernity is one of non-ethics of relations, right? One in which you just feel like you actually don't need a relationship with other humans or people who you might not even deem as human or human enough, and non-human animals. And then there is the part of it where you move into kind of the eco-fascist territory, right? Where folks are just like, and what else? We don't deserve to be here. So just let the earth wipe us out, right? As if we are all equally guilty of the total destruction of our lived environment, right? So there's something really apt in the way that you're capturing the question of consent. And then at both ends of like settler and colonial futures, and the way that they imagine them, there is a lack of consent for Black and Indigenous peoples and their descendants, right? Because you either like remake it into a new fashion, right? Now it's electric cars. Now we're just like mining. Now we're doing whatever. We're laying pipeline, whatever. Or just wipe us all out, right? And no one is, we don't have to ask anyone about that. Okay. I'm gonna go. You got me ranting. I'm gonna start ranting about this thing later on today. Okay.
Don't hold back.
Yeah. Yeah. But when I'm thinking about worlds otherwise, and part of that, was that the question, or was it about indigenous?
I would love for you to, because I was thinking about right Kyle's how he talks about indigenizing futures and how you talk about worlds otherwise as you're thinking. I think that's your own term kind of for thinking about post-disaster futures. So I'd love for you to talk about that.
I think the world otherwise is very much as I was building this book in works that kind of in chapters that build on each other and concepts that build on each other that are pulling from the literature and the imagination of these Afro-Indigenous Caribbean and Indigenous African writers. I was thinking about how the logics that support their work in the world are fundamentally in opposition to colonization and settler colonialism, right? That is, that if it were up to the kind of world system that we live in, and I am saying like world system, yes, at the Allah, Wallerstein, et cetera, but if it were up to that world system, then we would not only not be writing, but not even be thinking, right? We might at the very height of it be just laboring bodies, right? So I was working through the question of worlds otherwise and saying like, wow, not only are they writing, and that in and of itself is a subversion of a system that would see them as like not only ahistorical, but incapable of imagining a future for themselves, unless we tell them exactly what to buy and what to do, but that it has a different ethics. And so in this world and in this way that we're thinking about it, not only is there a commitment to the sacred, it rejects that which requires the death of the sacred, or that the idea that in order to be like a fully human man, one in the Winterian sense in the world, one would have to be, someone who would reject all kinds of spiritual practices, et cetera, et cetera. So it rejects that by delving deeply into one's past, one's ancestors, and imagining and trying to consider that you are not only living a future, as Kyle writes, that they could not have imagined, right? Like a kind of horrific relations of all kinds, but that also that they had a wish for you to live a different life, right? And that there's a possible communion, there's a possible way that you can tap into that. And this is something that is coming across so many traditions, right? And it's something that through our education, through our kind of assimilation into systems of knowledge, including the university system, we are told to doubt and we are told to not engage in because it's just like fantasy, it's just fiction, it's just whatever, right? But for me, the world otherwise becomes a way of thinking differently, to imagine having a different kind of ethics, to imagine the world and the possibilities and those cracks of modernity. That includes our relationships with ourselves, with others, but it also is committed to not shoving people into like genres, right? Like not only genres of the human, but also genres in terms of like the kinds of work that we do, so that the theoretical text, the philosophy, the mathematics, the science, the poetry, all of these things can come together on the same plane, right? That one is not seen as like some frivolity, right? And the other one is seen as like actual science that's moving the world forward. When in fact, what we see is when the shit hits the fan and climate change and all the disasters that a lot of white people are scared about, when that happens, all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, and we love indigenous people. And we're so sorry. And also they are the key to our future. And also, do you see how, these people live so simply and we should just get a tiny house and all that shit, right? Like, so you realize that in these moments of crisis, the turn back is to us and our people, our imaginations, our like living in this moment. And not to say that we're all living great, right? Because we do come from communities that are struggling. But I do think that worlds otherwise would take seriously that which attempts to subvert and eradicate anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, take seriously that we come from a long lineage of people that imagine their lives differently, and by in turn our lives differently, and how we imagine our descendants' lives being very different than this, and the hopes that we have for them. And so if we were to take seriously our own hopes for the future, then just imagine what our ancestors had for us, and then imagine taking that as the first step towards the everyday relations that you make in all the actions that you do. And so this is not just kind of like an imaginary, but also like a material practice in the world that we can take up. So, I mean, I think I will leave that there. There's a few other things, but I'm sure we'll get to it in the next question.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy for you to take up space picking up on things. And I want to invite everybody to submit any questions using the Q&A function. But for now, I'm going to continue asking questions. And I want to pick up on what you both are saying. I love how you both are articulating how like imagining futures, right, requires this like reconnection to the sacred, reconnection to ancestral practices, and learning and remembering like their ethics and their different ways of enacting and practicing consent. But I'm hearing in both of you this like you know, you both are naming this tendency of how the solutions of climate change are often just as problematic, and how these precisely these like ancestral practices and ancestral knowledges are now being extracted, right? Like now everybody, exactly what you were saying, Yomaira, like now there's like this interest in, and which kind of continues to see also I feel like there's like this beautiful and positive thing of remembering the ancestral, and then there's this extractive way that I see it practiced that like puts Indigenous people and Black communities like in this past, right? Oh, you all have like this connection to the past, and now we want to be able to extract it and use it right now that we're facing crisis. Now that everybody is facing crisis and not just you all, now all these knowledges are great for us to extract. And just, I'm wondering if you guys can continue thinking about how we deal with this tendency.
Well, I think that the points that Yomaira was just making are really amazing. And one reason why, you know, when I was listening is about, you know, what it says to people's imagination and how they understand fiction and storytelling in relation to the types of issues that we're talking about here. You know, so for example, a couple of quick points on this. So often when I talk about Indigenous ethics and so on, sometimes I'll get like a non-Indigenous person, like a white person, usually being like, well, actually, I mean, colonization was so bad. I mean, how could you even be talking about that? And then when I see their own fiction about colonialism, it's always that, yeah, the people that were colonized are done, they're toast. We're, you know, whatever's being imagined here in fiction is just showing the end, right? The worlds disappear. And I realized that in their own storytelling, they can't do both. It's like they can't imagine it. Yeah, it really was that bad. In fact, it was worse than even they could imagine it, right? Yeah, it was all that. But at the same time, we're also here talking about ethics and consent and the sacred and futurity. They can't storytell that way. But we can. And they've done a lot of damage, the settler population, the racist population as well, in terms of how they have developed solutions to climate change. And a lot of that is also has these important narrative dimensions to it. One of the ones that I'm particularly sensitive to, and that's very problematic, is on the one hand, they have created these narratives about solutions to climate change that are destroying Indigenous people and that are extremely violent. But on the other hand, if you look at any climate event, any conference, activity, science, UNFCCC, anything, you'll see that it's mostly like what white and dominant people want, but there's always an Indigenous track. Well, what is that track? And if you go to it, yeah, there's people that are trying to advocate and do good in that space, but it's usually the track that people want to participate on, so they don't have to deal with anti-Blackness, or they don't have to deal with other forms of anti-oppression. And so they've also reinvented a type of indigeneity as a horrible excuse and as a horrible source of assuagement to then deflect the ethical commitments that they still haven't come to.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about this in the context of like a post-disaster future. So maybe it's a post-post, you know?
Yeah.
Or because we are living a disaster right now, we can just take a second to think about not just what is happening in our own backyards here, down the street, in Michigan, in Puerto Rico, but we can also think about what's happening in Gaza, right? We could think about the disaster that we are watching unfold before our very eyes in Palestine. And I think that is a disaster. That future is now, right? And our post-disaster futures beg the question, what are we willing to give up? And I think that's also the question that many of these folks, whether they be theorists, academics, or environmentalists, or scientists, or just everyday folks who are worried about the impending apocalyptic future and climate change, might need to ask themselves, or not even might need to ask themselves, is what are they willing to give up in the face of this impending disaster where, again, there is, as Kyle put it, this lack of consent around what is our collective strategy, right? And then I think that there is something really important about that balance, because it's not all like rainbows and sunshines and my ancestors love me and whatever, and wildest dream can say, yo, all that's great, but that's not what we're talking about, right? Or that's, at least that's not what I'm talking about. Because I think we have to think seriously about what it means to do the work in the place that we are now, knowing what we know of our past, both in our own communities and as a collective, right? And then thinking about what that means, like what does that charge us with? What does that equip us with? And what does it mean for us in terms of responsibilities that we've been given in terms of moving forward? So a post-disaster future, which is the moment that we're living in now, preparing for even more impending disasters, means that we have to not only think seriously about folks who are engaging in all types of corruption that exacerbate the problem, but also our own. And I think Kyle's article ends really beautifully, Kyle, when you talk about, do we want to be really the people who cover up the errors of our ancestors, right? Or in the moment, the errors that we're engaging in right now, right? Like, what is that we're doing right now that might be exacerbating the problem, committing forms of relational or interpersonal violence, right? What are the ways that we are engaging in forms of consumption that it also exacerbate climate change, todo esto, right? All of that is there. And that also goes back to the question, it's like, what are we willing to give up in the kind of comforts of modernity? If we want to take seriously, like, that there has to be a change, at the same time that we know that the bigger change is not necessarily with us, but with the political structures, the private planes or whatever the fuck, that, you know, all the types of shit, right? Like, the drilling, the displacement, the extraction, all of that. So I don't know, it becomes, this is a kind of larger question for me to think about that in that lens.
I really like how you ended, Yomaira, with thinking about, like, of course, the biggest problems are not within people of color, but how, like, it's just reminding me of how you talk about decolonial love too, as and you know, your whole book is about really South-South relationships, and that's something that I just think a lot about too in my own work, of how can we start with like decolonizing our own relationship, of course, to the land, but also to each other. And building off this question, we have only a few minutes left, so I'll ask this one and maybe we can end here. Is there's a question in the chat of how the concepts of environment, if you all think that the concepts of environmental justice and climate justice, if they're valuable concepts, or if you think that they're imbued with the same colonial mindset that doesn't sufficiently question the present moment. Do you each have thoughts about that?
Yeah, with some of these concepts that are in, dominant languages, just to begin with, I think in my experience as an organizer, advocate, program initiative builder, policy person, you learn about the appropriate ways and contexts to use these terms. And like, I know a lot of contexts where environmental justice is how you fire folks up, and it's a powerful concept. But all the communities I got started working with, they never use that term, or climate justice, and it doesn't mean anything. It's not going to fire anybody up. And the more you seek to work at different scales, I started off working locally. I never used any of these terms, any of them. But if you're pushed by other people to serve at broader scales, it's because they expect you and are going to hold you accountable to how you use the terms, and are going to be watching and checking you on that. And so you have to learn these different skills. And now a lot of the work I do, at least for the short term, is international, and that is introduced a whole different layer to how to use terminology. And so I think these conversations about the meaning of terms and so on, they're not actually at all nitpicky or anything. They're critical. And the minute you think that you're like beyond it, or, oh, that's just nitpicky, then you really have lost something. You've lost an edge to your advocacy.
I agree, Kyle. And I mean, I think one of the things, the kind of questions that would come up for me in the context of environmental justice and climate justice is, who is in this conversation and where are you located? So it's the geospecificity is necessary, the kind of blanket statements, the kind of recommendations coming from the other side of the world or wherever might not be the thing that we necessarily need in the Caribbean surrounded by an ocean and a sea. It might not be what we need in the Great Lakes region surrounded by 5 enormous lakes, right? Like, it might not be what we need if you're located in the desert or, wherever else. So the specificity of who gets to participate in these conversations, who sees themselves as the leaders of these movements, what voices are, allowed to take, take a mic here, right? I think that becomes important, whether we're thinking, I think I always laugh at the memes and the kind of tweets about people's like, oh, my mother was the first environmentalist. She has a bag full of 1,000 plastic bags under the kitchen sink, right? Like, our folks have been recycling. Do you not see this tub of butter like full of beans in the fridge? We've had it for 15 years, like, right? And so we can think about who are the people most peripheralized, the most marginalized in the conversation about environmental justice and climate justice. Like, who are the people who are going to be the first to be affected by this, and why and how? Why are they not in the conversation if they're not? And how do we center them in the conversation moving forward? And I think that's the only way that we can get the colonial mindset to move, to like use the words of this question, and to make the conversation much more sufficient in our present moment. Otherwise, it's just folks writing about it and thinking about it from, their fancy home where they're not going to get flooded, right? Or, maybe they have like a fucking bunker somewhere with lots of cans of shit, and they're going to be fine, eating expired beans for some time, like whatever the case may be, however they're thinking about it. But oftentimes it's the most privileged people who get the space to imagine what the future looks like because they're worried about that. And I think the literature becomes such an important part of that, because then you can see it. There's one way to like think about it, you see it and you're like, maybe. But then sometimes when your imagination is activated, like in some of the stories that, that are coming out of the Caribbean and coming out of Equatorial Guinea, when you realize that from their point of view, they can imagine, and actually they're seeing it right now in Equatorial Guinea, when Juan Tomas is writing Pangarilene, and it's like the first Afrofuturist novel, if you could call it that, but that genre, there's a question about genre there, is there. But when you go to Equatorial Guinea, you see the afterlives of colonialism in action. You see a dictatorship, you see extraction, you see world corporations drilling into the ocean. You see the complete difference between like the Sofitel, the beautiful hotels where all the like oil barons go, and then where everyone else lives. And you realize that this imagined future that he's writing about, where there's like radical dehumanization and fundamental, you know, environmental catastrophes happening, is not just in his future unknown date, but they're living it right this minute. And that this book that is seen as like science fiction is actually more akin to history. Then you begin to say, okay, this can activate the imagination. This you know, maybe I could teach a seminar on environmental justice and maybe I'll get 1 or 2 folks who love their Nalgene bottle in the clean canteen, right? But if I teach this other course where I'm teaching this, like this literature as history, this, you know, this reflection of the lived experience, I can capture hearts and minds that way, right? And this can actually help us be able to make tangible for us what people are experiencing in other places, right? It moves us, right? And I think that's also part of the larger project when Sylvia Winter talks about the kind of reimagining the human, right? And she talks about the literary studia, right? The humanitatis, right? The poetics as part of that storytelling that Kyle talks about, right? As the first step to being able to be in relation with one another. And I think that is a necessary part of any kind of environmental justice movement, any climate justice movement. And it's also part of how do we activate and move through the changes that are coming in the current disaster and the future disaster and our post disaster futures, right? So that's how I would enter that.
Beautiful. I think that's a really great way to end, and I feel like it really also came full circle with thinking about how we started with Kyle talking about like the privilege of feeling like there's an impending apocalypse, and how you're talking about this literature that's narrating, that isn't science fiction, right? That's narrating just what's currently happening. So I just want to say thank you both for being so generous with your thoughts and with your time. And I want to let everybody that's listening know that this event is being recorded and that you'll be able to see it on Centro's platforms. Where Bridging the Divides is going to continue our speaker series at the end of April, but Centro has a bunch of super dope events coming up. I'm excited. I want to attend every single one. So I encourage everybody to I will be actually coming through. So yeah, just wanted to encourage everybody to check those out, and thank you all for coming. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.